The year is 1921. You are shooting a knockoff Dracula film in the heart of Slovakia with a single camera, an actual Satanist on set, and a guy who looks like this. Surrounded by presumably a lot of confused Slovakian onlookers. You've received personal blessings for your project from the Prince of Darkness himself, Aleister Crowley, despite being in clear copyright infringement violation of an arguably much cooler Prince of Darkness. Somewhere in London, Bram Stoker is rolling around in his grave as his widow's eyes turn into dollar signs as she realizes the potential of a slam dunk intellectual property lawsuit. You're in luck. The world has never seen a vampire movie because before this day in 1921, no vampire movie had ever existed. And you, despite being a silent film director, you are so obsessed with sound, you subtitle your movie The Symphony of Horror and direct all stage movement with a metronome in the palm of your hand. Your name is F.W. Murnau. Your film is Nosferatu. Nosferatu is, without a doubt, one of the most influential horror movies to ever exist. But perhaps the most interesting thing about it is that much of the original score has been lost, providing us with an excellent backdrop on which to examine the idea of scary sounds. As film composers, it's our job to give voice to the subtext of a movie through music. One framework for understanding music is as an expression and extension of the human voice. Just like language, different kinds of music have very specific vocabulary, which conjures certain images in the mind of the listener. Instrumentation, like accents, shape the lens through which our eyes see the world we're brought into. And nothing screams terror quite like a Frankenstein, even if it's just an instrument. It's something that's uncanny, yet familiar. A subversion of expectation. Your eyes see a vintage black and white film. Perhaps you think of the Hollywood Golden Age scores of old, romantic strings and dramatic blooming crescendos. But instead, you're met with a dense, atonal Foley score, more soundscape than orchestra, filled with dark, metallic sounds and distorted bowing. The dissonance goes beyond the harmony of the music. It wedges itself firmly between the expectation of the listener and what is actually heard. Fear through music can come from a lot of different places. Jump scare stinger chords, uneasy, unresolved tension, theremins, But in the curious case of us rescoring Nosferatu, fear comes from a perversion of beauty, a familiar instrument broken and reshaped into something mangled. Instrumentation is not the composer's only tool for terror. Where you play that instrument is also a factor. When we push a melody into an uncomfortable range for our instrument, we feel the struggle. The audience can sense the tension between the instrument and the player. We expect our melodies to remain more or less within the middle of our instrument's range, and when we divert from that, we intuit discomfort. And what about rhythm? I wasn't joking earlier when I said that Murnau directed all stage movement with a metronome. In her novel From Wagner to Murnau, author Jo Leslie Collier describes the film as a symphony created with the harmony of bodies and the rhythm of space. She goes on to detail how Murnau used the movement of objects and characters within shots to establish tempo and rhythm in his films. Murnau himself said that his approach to blocking scenes was all about attempting to convey tonal chords in space. As composers, it's important to pay attention to the rhythm of the scenes themselves. This is perhaps most important in the horror genre. We follow the direction of our conductor, in this case, Murnau, and put his dramatic rhythms reflected in the movement of his characters to sound. But we also must remember that we're not just writing notes on a page or controlling for just the limitations and colors of an orchestra. We live in the 21st century, after all. There's more than one way to make a scary sound, and one element that might be the most important element to consider goes far beyond traditional theory, and that's production. How we record and mix our sounds plays just about as much role as the sounds themselves. Take our Frankenstein violin, for example. Let's listen to it with effects and processing, and then without. Which one did you find to be more terrifying? Because for my money, it's the one drenched in reverb. Of course, you've got to be mindful with the effects you're adding. There's a right time to do this, there's a wrong time to do this, and subtlety speaks volumes. This is a glimpse at how I, as a composer, understand scary sounds. But I'm also interested in the nitty-gritty science of it. I mean, what is it about these sounds that signals our brains that we should be scared or not? In order to answer that, we're gonna need to perform an autopsy. An audio autopsy. This is the anatomy of a scream. Not just any scream, a blood-curdling scream, a scream worthy of the finest of Halloween B movies. This scream. This scream and others like it have what acousticians call a high degree of roughness. Roughness was a term introduced in psychoacoustics literature in the 19th century by this dude, Hermann Helmholtz, who used it to describe the buzzing sensation you experience when you hear two very close intervals right next to each other, like this channel's favorite, the minor second. Although nowadays, this sensation you feel when someone subjects you to some spicy intervals has been retermed as tonal or sensory dissonance. Roughness in today's literature has also gone through a bit of a rebrand and is now commonly understood as the acoustic property, which refers to the rate at which the amplitude of a given sound changes. In conversation, roughness fluctuates around 4 to 5 times per second. But in screaming, it's much higher, around 30 to 150 times per second. Our brain does not perceive this roughness as a rapid change in volume, but rather as shrill and unpleasant. This shrill and unpleasant sound is what we call in bioacoustics a nonlinearity. Nonlinearities can be thought of as sounds that break from the given norm of a situation. A scream, for instance, I guess, unless you're Norman Bates, is not what you expect to hear in a given situation, and as such, it's considered a nonlinearity. And excuse the rant, but I feel it's worth saying because if you try and look into this stuff for yourself, it gets a little bit confusing. The term nonlinear or nonlinearity is a bit of a mess. It's often loosely defined, and its definition changes from discipline to discipline. Some video game composers, for example, will classify linear and nonlinear sounds based on their modularity with concepts such as vertical and horizontal mixing. More on that in the description if you're interested. Music theorists have been known to call everything from unexpected dynamic shifts to distortion to extended range playing nonlinearities. And then you have nonlinear acoustics, which is a branch of physics that deals with loud sounds, but usually when an acoustician is talking about nonlinearities, he's talking like sonic boom levels of loud, not like human scream levels of loud. And don't even get me started on simulated nonlinearities, which is a term that biologists use to differentiate loud sounds made by organics and by machines. For the purposes of this video, I'll keep it real simple and say that a nonlinear sound is a sound that pushes the tolerance of a given system. So if you're talking about the system of a human voice, a scream is a nonlinearity. And in the system of a tube amplifier, pushing the signal so loud that the amp starts to distort is also a nonlinearity. And in the context of whatever one expects to hear in the sky as a jet going by so fast that it breaks the sound barrier and causes a sonic boom is a nonlinearity as well. Humans are programmed to have a visceral response to biological nonlinearities. A 1990 paper, Bifurcations and Chaos in Newborn Infant Cries, backs this up with a study showing that humans respond significantly more to infant cries that contain nonlinearities. But you probably don't need a scientific paper to tell you that we pay attention when babies cry. It's a very intuitive thing, just like your response to a genuine scream of terror. It's something that demands your attention and makes the hairs on the back of your neck stand straight up. So we have our scream, which is a nonlinearity, created in large part because of the high degree of roughness in its anatomy. How does that help us understand why we find horror music to be scary? Could it be that the same quality of roughness present in human screams is also present in a lot of horror music? Well, a 2020 study posted in the Journal of the Acoustical Society of America sought to formally test this. They compared 100 individual sound samples and classified them into 4 different types of sounds: screaming, non-screaming vocalizations,
I'm very highly educated. I know words, I have the best words,
horror music, and non-horror music. In dissecting the anatomy of all of these sounds, researchers were able to identify a clear pattern. The same abnormally high degree of roughness that was present in screaming was only otherwise present in horror music. A behavioral study was then conducted which identified higher arousal levels in those who listened to screaming and horror music than those who listened to non-screaming vocalizations and non-horror music. Now, there's obviously a lot of bias that can go into something like this, and I don't think this study adequately addresses that. For example, who is selecting these sound samples? What is their criteria? And what's their methodology behind classification? I'm unsure. I'd like to see more study done in this area, but taking it as it is, it seems like it might confirm our suspicion that horror music is scary, in part because it's evocative of a human scream, or at the very least, that roughness plays a role in why we find certain sounds to be scary. And this is something that film composers must understand, at least on an unconscious level, because another 2010 study on nonlinear analogues in soundtrack music found that horror films utilize nonlinear, high roughness sounds significantly more than any other genre of film. So is it just the degree of roughness in a sound's anatomy which determines its fright level? Well, let's put on our neuroscience/psychology hats and see if we can figure that out. Most of our senses are actually pretty slow. To illustrate this, I'll compare a scary sight to a scary sound. Let's pretend you are this guy in the world of Nosferatu. You're just a friendly sailor aboard the voyage of the Demeter. All you care about is not swabbing the poop deck and presumably avoiding getting scurvy. And then you go down to the cargo hold and see this. Scary, right? Well, not immediately, because in order to see and then process this, light needs to hit your eyeballs. Your corneas and pupils will take in that light, which will then travel through your lenses to the back of your retinas. Your retinas are loaded with a bunch of photoreceptors whose job it is to convert light into electrical signals. These electrical signals move through the optic nerve to the center of the brain where they get sorted. Then they get shot to the back of your brain to the primary visual cortex where they get decoded. Then they get sent elsewhere for you to remember and determine if what you're seeing is a threat or not. Suffice it to say, you're pretty much dead by the time you realize what's going on. But let's imagine instead a world where you're this guy, above deck. You hear the scream of your friend below, getting the kiss of death from, I guess, death himself, and your body immediately tenses at the sound of his shriek. Your muscles that are primed for flight activate, your heart rate jumps up, you assume a defensive posture, and your vision focuses like a beam towards the threat. This happens incredibly quick, like way quicker than the guy who just saw Nosferatu. You see, humans and most hearing animals have a sort of acoustic startle circuit built inside them. This is a very adaptive way of quickly putting us in defense mode. The acoustic startle circuit is far more efficient than visual processing. In fact, it only has to go through 5 neurons in order to get your body into gear. It goes something like this. The pressure wave from the screen below vibrates out. That vibration is picked up by the cochlea in your inner ear. This travels to the ventral cochlear nucleus, responsible for encoding intensity and temporal information, aka the part of the system which identifies what direction a sound is coming from. It then travels through the nucleus of the lateral lemniscus to the reticular pontine nucleus. This is where eye movement and attention is coordinated. The vibration then goes down spinal interneurons to our motor neurons. And congratulations, your body is now aware of the threat. Perhaps you'll have a chance to survive, although given that you're on a ship in the middle of nowhere with a blood-sucking monster, probably not. 5 synapses in 10 milliseconds. That's 1/100th of a second to go from sudden sound to sudden jump. It's quick because this is a mechanical process and not a chemical one. Something that no doubt has aided our survival and as such is a trait that has survived the ages. We're all just trying to get ourselves further in the future. That's it. Although just because your startle circuit has been triggered, it doesn't necessarily mean you're scared. It just means you reacted. I mean, it's such a fast process, it's automatic, it's so hardwired, you can't escape it. What if, upon hearing the scream of your shipmate below, he popped up and said, "Oh, sorry, I didn't mean to scare you, I just tripped and I screamed." You'd feel relief immediately as your brain sends signals everywhere to disengage and come down off of red alert. Your brain needs a bit of time to fully process and understand a situation. That's why many say that jump scares and stinger chords in films are a bit of a cheap trick. Our body is hardwired to respond to them, so the scare, while effective at making us jump, doesn't feel deserved. So what about the other kind of scary? The slow kind of fear that makes a film or a soundscape linger in our minds for days after we've left the theater. This type of fear has much more to do with personal, emotional, and cultural associations. Take Nosferatu, for instance. It's one of the most iconic horror movies of all time. One review at the time called it the most bone-chilling, frightening film to ever hit cinema. Max Schreck, the actor who portrayed Nosferatu, was accused of being an actual vampire when the film premiered. Heck, the Swedish government literally banned the movie for, quote, excessive horror until 1972. But here's the thing, Nosferatu isn't scary anymore. Almost none of the original boom of 1930s monster movies are. Nosferatu is not dynamic. Its black and white shots are often long, drawn out and trying on the patience. The dialogue is so cheesy, and since it's a silent film, it must be read in these immersion-breaking slide cards which stay on the screen for way too long. The practical effects are of the time, but to modern eyes, they just kind of come across as shoddy. To his credit, Max Schreck does look pretty creepy in the role, but his expressions are so overacted, it almost plays as comical. And just for reference, here's a part of the original surviving soundtrack. I don't know about you, but to me, that doesn't quite scream symphony of horror. And that's not just my opinion either. In his article, Is Halloween Still Scary 35 Years Later, journalist Kevin Polloway showed 10 college students John Carpenter's Halloween for the first time to see if the film was still scary to a modern audience. The group unanimously found the film to be cheesy, silly, dated, and predictable. Essentially, not scary at all. And that's Halloween, which came out in 1978, not Nosferatu, which came out in 1922. I ran an informal poll on my Instagram to see if people found Nosferatu scary, and 62% of them said no. And yeah, I recognize that 10 college kids is not a significant sample size, and to be frank, neither is 377 Instagram participants either. So feel free to disagree whether Nosferatu is scary or not in the comments below. But I'm going forward with the assumption that it's not that scary, at least sitting here in 2023. Now, it's not my intention to just put Nosferatu on blast, but rather to try and answer the question, why isn't it scary now, but it was 100 years ago? Well, for starters, the movie is German, made by Germans for the Germany of 1922. Almost everyone in the cast and everyone who would be watching the film for the first time had the Great War on their mind, because most had served in some capacity towards the war effort. Look no further than the canon of World War I poetry to find tales littered of rats feasting on the fallen in the trenches on the Western Front. The idea of rats brought different, visceral, very real associations to the people of the time in a way that we are more or less desensitized to now. So when Nosferatu emerges and hundreds of rats appear, it hits differently to the people of the 20s than it does to the people of our 20s. Similarly, in the scene where Nosferatu appears and fog emerges behind him, you and I just think, oh, it's fog. We don't have the same cultural fear and associations that our 1920s ancestors did, which is that fog is probably poison gas, a method used to kill tens of thousands in World War I. Nosferatu literally means plague spreader, and the film is basically about a foreigner coming into your land and destroying your way of life through death, despair, and disease. I'm not exactly privy to German foreign policy sentiment in the 1920s, but given what would happen just a decade or so later, I'd say it's not out of the realm of possibility that this film preyed on the fears of a German audience. Cinema was also still fairly new at this time, so it may be easy to say that something like this isn't scary when you have the opportunity to compare it to this.
Matt?
Over the decades, we get used to certain conventions, better and better CGI, and practical effects, which make the parlor tricks of old look like a cheap student film. We get desensitized as things fall out of fashion and new techniques come about. And at the same time, our shared cultural fears have shifted. Horror films morphed into the classic slasher films of the 1980s, which brought terror from mythical folklore embodied in these early monster films into your neighborhood, where terror took the form of invasions and possessions. This is a much more visceral, real kind of fear. A fear which beckoned a new kind of soundtrack fueled by synthesizers and other John Carpenter-esque things. Today, film scores look a lot more like how we rescored Nosferatu. Favoring minimal soundscapes, discovering fear in silence held just a little too long. Looping back to our original question, what makes a sound scary? To say it's a lot of things is a bit of an understatement. In some ways, what was once scary will always be. And in other ways, what we find scary is always shifting. What I think is really amazing is how deeply rooted our fear and fear response is, and better yet, how we as composers are able to simulate and manipulate this to craft an emotional journey which can rock the foundation of our physiology. Thank you so much for taking the time and watching this video. I really appreciate it. If you're new to the channel, hi, I'm Levi. I make music theory essays like this one where I flew to the heart of Pennsylvania to investigate a field of musical boulders in order to uncover a song that hadn't been heard in 115 years. Or this one, where we reimagined what Radiohead might sound like in an alternate universe where we had 31 notes per octave instead of 12. Oh, and I also make bass videos. If any of that sounds remotely interesting to you, please consider subscribing and or joining us over on Patreon. Thank you so much to my patrons now on screen over on Patreon for making this video and all other future videos possible.
Nosferatu!